built. They restored features that had been removed from documentary evidence, so it still preserves the 6/6 windows that are twice as tall as they are wide. You can see there's a consistency in the vernacular in these buildings that you see throughout the village. It's simple, but there's a harmony, grace, and sense of proportion to the whole thing. Excuse me. With a different strategy was taken with the mill. The mill was a clearly modern building, industrial building when it was built. It was a continuous pour. In 1937, they put the forms at the bottom and they just elevated them and continuously poured concrete until they got to the top. The walls are about 12 inches thick, and they are reinforced about every 5 inches with steel rods that are that thick. So when they took all the bins outside, people, oh, it's going to collapse. No, that thing will be here probably after every building in the village is long gone. That grain silo will be here because it's built that solid way. But the renovations were intended to be modern, so the windows are completely modern. It's consistent with the aesthetic of when that building was built. Again, you needed windows if it was going to be offices, so those are entirely appropriate. The board also approved cell tower equipment on the roof because there originally was grain equipment on the roof, so they figured, well, the modern equivalent of that is cell tower equipment, and that's why it was approved. The warehouse was torn down. It had been compromised. Trucks had backed into it, and it was not structurally sound. It also was the least visible element from the street. So what you see from the street and the canal is basically the stain, and they abided by the rule, the minimum amount of change necessary to accommodate the perfect use. There's only 3 grain silos in the United States that have been rehabilitated. One's a hotel, one's a residence hall for a college in Ohio, and there's one they're working on in Buffalo to do something like this today. But we were, like in so many things in Pittsford, we're on the cutting edge. Flour mill property. Mike Newcomb Sr. in the 1940s was selling fuel oil, and so at one point there were 5 big fuel oil tanks here and a gas station. And as this area sort of transformed, he transformed that building to fit in with everything else. But this originally was another fuel oil swing. This is what the flour mill originally, you can see it's shorter than it is today. And after it was the Pittsford Flour Milling Company, it became Victor Flour Milling, and then there was a Dutch conglomerate that bought it out. And this is the way the coal tower looked when I was a kid.
And this is the one that got torn down?
That's the one that got torn down, that's correct, yep. And this is the tube, so this was the head house that operated all the conveyors for the wheat, and then they sent it down here, and this tube actually, there's a later photograph, the tube went to the ridge, and then went down through the equipment in that building to when the wheat was turned into flour.
And the source of the steam was coal?
Well, originally it was steam powered, and originally it would have been coal. Of course, it was converted to electricity. They called them electric roller mills at one point, but through much of the history here, it was actually run by electric. Yep. And let's cross the street, and we can go in front of the little office building. We can talk about the building. Coming back here, it just makes me appreciate how beautiful this place is. Anyway, Samuel Hutchison, who had the warehouses that were along the canal over there, those were torn down when the canal was widened. He built this complex in about 1913, and originally his primary business was produce. There was an apple dry house that burned in the 1920s, and that's about the time refrigeration came in, so it wasn't rebuilt. But the business continued and expanded. This was the office. Again, you can see there's the scales there, where until the late 1990s, trucks fully loaded came in, dumped their load, and then were reweighed to determine how much the farmer was paid for the wheat or red kidney beans that were dumped here. This building, as I mentioned before, the business passed from Samuel Hutchison to his son Herbert Hutchison, Herbert's brother Samuel Jr., Pittsford in 1932, where it went down to, Audrey, help me out. Do you remember how low it went? I think it was 32 below zero. But it killed all of the fruit trees away from the lake, and all the orchards in Pittsford were decimated. And that was the end of the produce business. Ted had the idea to, convert it into the wheat, oats, and kidney beans business, and lucked out because the timing before World War II was optimal. So he constructed the silver building there, which is essentially a series of bins inside to hold raw product. The building behind the office is a processing building, and then the building on this end was moved from Geneseo. It was 2 carpenters in 2 weeks dismantled and reassembled that building. You can see part of it is still clad in the original wood. Part of it has metal siding because they couldn't re-salvage all of the wood, but you can see how meticulous they were to do that. This was located alongside the railroad tracks somewhere in Geneseo. It was built in 1896. So it's because it hasn't been altered. That's a truck shed where they kept the trucks for the vehicles. The complex has complete integrity at the current time. It's one of the most highly photographed landmarks we have in the village. Okay, any questions?
Bob,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about what the plans are to get to? There's a lot of talk about changing these
Can I
buildings
talk
back
about
here.
that? How about one of the other trustees? I have to recuse myself from the project because my aunt and uncle Betsy and Roger Powers are proposing selling this to Wilmerite, so I should not speak really about the proposed project. But Lily Lanfear, who is handling the projects in my recusal, can.
Do you have a specific question? Because we don't have an application at this time, so there really isn't anything that I can comment on because we don't really have anything yet. So.
Oh, but I thought there was a proposal to take down some of the buildings but leave some.
We really don't have anything formally in front of us yet, so I really can't comment on it. So when we get an application, though, we'll have a public hearing and welcome your comments.
And as with all applications to village, as soon as an application is received, it will be available, so any of you are welcome to take a look at it ahead of a meeting.
Did you talk about this little building here, Bob, and the fact there was a ticker tape in there for many years?
Yeah, well, my grandfather had 2 seats on the Chicago Board of Trade, so he watched the commodities, and there was a ticker tape. And although the windows are boarded over, it's a little time capsule inside, and it hasn't changed since the doors were shut in 1996, and it looks like 1913 when the building was built. It's because they haven't maintained the windows, and that was easier than fixing the glass.
There's still a counter, there's still a weight scale,
Everything is still in there. There's beaded board siding.
It's fun to look.
And some of the original posters and everything are on the walls. It's really unique.
Barns too, that the
The original equipment is still inside, and most of it. The one wing that's been restained behind it, that has for maybe 15 years housed the RPS printing business. So the equipment has been removed from that section, although that section was primarily a warehouse anyway, so there wasn't much in there. But there's still equipment in there, and there's still equipment in that building, and well, some of that's been removed, but there still is equipment in the red building behind there.
Bob, I count 4 buildings, or there are 4 or 5 in that complex?
I would say, it depends how you count them.
Okay.
I would say there's 4 major buildings and then 2 minor buildings. So I would count a total of 6.
Okay. And what would you call each of the buildings?
I would call this the office.
The white one?
Right behind the office is the original mill.
The red one?
The red one. The silver building is the bin building. Over to the left is the truck shed. What is now housing RPS is the old warehouse. And the building from Geneseo, I would call the Geneseo barn.
Okay. Is that red one?
That's the big long red one.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
Which has a fantastic interior. It hasn't been altered. It's almost cathedral-like in the proportions inside, and there's wooden boards that have aged. So it's a spectacular interior with the original cast iron equipment inside, also in scales. So it's really a piece in itself.
Do you think they'd ever allow people to throw any stones?
Well, some of them have holes, and they aren't really equipped, so it's a little bit dangerous. There's parts that it would certainly be safe to go in and see, but the Silver Building in particular, because it's missing floors in certain places, would be a hard one to see the inside.
The Pittsford Farms Dairy, the 3 properties.
Yep.
Pittsford Farms. Did they grow fruit?
Pittsford, no. Well, there was an orchard on Pittsford Farms, and there was a landscape architect that laid the farm out for the Hawleys. And if you go behind the dairy, the main lane splits at the village line, and they have what is called the mile square, because when they had horses, every day they would exercise the horses by taking them around the mile square. So there's a lane that goes around in a square, and it's lined with sugar maples, and that was one of the features of the landscape architect. There also was an orchard, but the farm was pretty much dedicated to growing hay and things for the animals, because all of the fields behind Schoen Place, and for those new residents, the farm is one of 8 farms in Pittsford that 20 years ago the town purchased the development rights for. So this land is protected in perpetuity. It will always be farmland. It's not developable. Anyway, all these fields here were pastures for the cows and horses, because they would eat the grass down, and then they would take the cows to the next pasture, let the grass recover, and they kept rotating it, and that's how the cows were fed. Because at that time, cows were primarily grass-fed. It was a much less efficient type of agriculture than we have today, and the cows were very carefully taken care of. And particularly on that farm, because the farm always, until really into the 1970s, prided itself with having the finest herd of cows. The cows were shown in exhibitions. At one point, the farm had Shetland ponies that were shown all over the United States. They sold ponies to Queen Victoria. It was a nationally known farm for what it was called scientific dairying. It had the first de la Velle separator with a dairy system in the Rochester area. Yes.
When you talk about Plum Farm, is that the photographer's building?
Yes, that is what is now Duncan Studio was Simon's Stones. I always get that wrong in the Two Brothers, but it was originally was a log cabin, then a federal house. Then Thomas Plum, an Englishman, moved here and added a second floor. Greek revitalized the house, had a farm, and when he sold it, it was consolidated with the pond. You can see a little indentation across the way. At one point, there were boat houses there, and village residents had boat houses. I think there's a couple remnants of foundations over there if you look carefully in the winter. But right about there, that's where the pond was. There's actually, the creek went underneath where that yellow building is, and today there's actually a pipe with a valve at the canal that goes underneath that building, and it feeds a creek that goes out onto the Powers farm and feeds their irrigation ponds. The dock over there had been a gas dock for boats. When the gas station closed, that disappeared. The village has received a grant, and that is going to be our third pavilion, like the other 2 here, for seating and fishing on the water. We're also going to do an interpretation panel to talk about the importance of preservation in Pittsford and recognize people that have done tremendous things for Pittsford, like our historian, Audrey Johnson. Where's Audrey?
Oh, did she drop off here?
Well, she left. Anyway, that should be coming later this year. We've done the design. We have to bid it. We hope we can start construction sometime this fall.
Can you speak more about the big spring and
Sure.
the Native American presence here over the course of
Yes,
centuries?
yes. There are numerous sensitive archaeological sites around the village. Although we don't know that there was an actual Seneca town here, we do know that there were encampments of Seneca and people before them in the village. And those only the people at the Rochester Museum know where those sites are, so the artifacts are protected. But it was probably because of the presence of the spring here. This was known by the Seneca people as a great source of fresh water, and as I mentioned before, there was a spur trail that went to the Denonville Trail. Basically went from the Genesee Falls in Rochester to Ganondagan, which was the primary Seneca city, and from there down to Canandaigua. There was through Pittsford, it crossed Marsh Road about where what's a landmark? About where the church is on the north side of 490. And from there was a spur trail that came right over here to the spring. And so we believe that's why he settled here. The reason the village, originally the village was at the milepost. There was a cluster of buildings around that intersection. That's why the Pioneer Cemetery is there. Stephen Lusk was the first settler to arrive here. Unfortunately, he had to go back to Massachusetts to get his family, and in the meantime, the Stones arrived, so they get credit for being the first residents. But he was actually here first. Because of the threat of British attack, people were not moving to Western New York, and only recently jurisdictional claims between Massachusetts and New York State over who owned Western New York were resolved. So to get people to settle here and solidify its claim to this territory, New York State constructed east-west roads, which were called state roads. One of them is Route 104, another one is Routes 5 and 20, and Route 31 was the one that crossed the main road from the Genesee Falls and to Canandaigua. And originally the main route from Rochester to Canandaigua was East Avenue through Main Street, out Route 64 to East Bloomfield, then that was the main way of going. So where those two crossed is where the village really grew. And about 1817, they realized the canal, the state had surveyed the route of the canal, and that's why everything migrated here. Samuel Hildreth, my father's, I don't know, great something relative, built the house where my parents live today in 1814, where Breathe Yoga was. He had a tavern there. Next to his house where Robert's Kitchens is, he had a stagecoach business that captured all of the trade from Lockport and Niagara Falls in the west and went all the way to Auburn and Syracuse in the east. And he died basically at the time the Auburn Line Railroad came through in about 1834, and that his barns had to be torn down for the railroad, which was somewhat ironic because the railroad has put the stagecoach business out of business. So that's a little history on that.
I just have one comment. I was talking with the owner of Duncan Studios, and he was telling me over the course of the years that he owned that building, they found numerous arrowheads and other artifacts down along the canal when the canal is drained. So
there's also on the farm, there's numerous arrowheads that have been found over the years on the farm. There's a whole collection. So it's a very active area. But don't tell anyone that.
yeah, right.
The new dock? Oh, the pavilion is going to be on that dock that's not used. So it's
That's the fifth building that you couldn't see before.
associated with that house, that was the original lumber yard. And the Wadhams and Whitlock, eventually it became Pittsford Lumber, but it was located over there. Boughton Avenue was known as Little Dublin. It was a lot of laborers and Irish immigrants and Italian immigrants that lived sort of the Catholic community of Pittsburgh. When the canal was widened, the lumberyard moved over here, which was next to the railroad. And one of the things, if you look down Schoen Place, in most of the village, all the buildings are parallel to the street, and they have front doors right on the street. If you look at this street, it's different. Why is that? Because there were railroad sidings that fingered in between all these buildings, and so all these different angles are because of the railroad, and it's what gives this area part of its charming character today, are sort of the unique angles the buildings are situated at. The shed with the red roof, that's the last piece of the lumber yard. In 1971, there was a fire, and it had burned before, but the whole thing burned down, and John Mason, who owned it, who lived in the little ranch house, which now has a business in it beyond the Label 7 restaurant, he started converting what was the lumber yard into shops and replacing the lumber sheds with little buildings, and that morphed. He really started the trend that established Schoen Place in what it is today. The wing of Label 7 that's closest to here is one of 2 remaining mule sheds on the canal. There's another one in Port Byron if you've gone by on the thruway, and they've restored an inn and tavern with a new rest stop on the thruway. You'll see there's an actual restored mule house, which will show you what the end of that building looked like originally. And it's so typical because many of the buildings down in there are older buildings that were repurposed. Some of them were grabbed from other places. At one point, when they were building houses on Toby Road, the sales office was moved here, and that originally was Bill Wall's. That burned down, and this building was built as a replacement, and it was intended to fit in with the character of the lumberyard. Again, it's an example of the effect on design that the Preservation Board has had throughout the building, throughout the village, so that even the new buildings fit in. So even though the use has changed and some of the buildings are newer, the essential layout of the lumberyard is still there, and it still has that character. And that's what's true of so much of Schoen Place, and why it's such an important asset for us to recognize and preserve today. And that's the end of my tour. All right.
Yeah.
Agreed.
On July 20th, the Botilla, which is a fleet of boats that is sailing from Seneca Falls to Cornhill Landing, I think, to celebrate the 200th anniversary of the Erie Canal and the 100th anniversary of New York State approving women's right to vote 2 years before the country did. There will be festivities all throughout the village, but the boats are going to dock at the Port of Pittsford.
The village's National Register Historic District was expanded to include virtually the entire village, except for the modern office parks and a few of the newer suburban neighborhoods on the edges of the village. But the farm, all of this is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Okay. Any questions?